just under 94% of SRD recipients use that grant for food. They use that grant to avoid hunger and starvation.
About 16 to 17 million people should be eligible for that SRD grant.
Dignity is the driving force behind UBI.
We are facing a grave issue of inequality as far as economic standing is concerned in our society.
South Africa's social grants lifeline is under threat. Right now, the National Treasury wants SASSA to cut back on grants, even threatening to pull its budget. Treasury says it's to protect the fiscus, but activists warn it will plunge millions into hunger. South Africa's not alone. Across the global south, countries like Brazil are facing the same crisis: how to protect people in tough times while maintaining a thriving economy. To unpack this, I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Kelle Howson from the Institute for Economic Justice, Thandi Henkeman from Black Sash, and Leandro Ferreira, head of the Brazilian Basic Income Network. Together, we'll ask, are social grants enough, or is it time for a bold new step, a universal basic income? Welcome to another episode of Economic Justice Matters, brought to you by the Institute for Economic Justice. And if you want to dig deeper, follow the IEJ and subscribe to their newsletter for some of the best research on social protection today. Thank you all so much for joining me. It's really wonderful to have you. And Kelle, could we begin with you? In terms of South Africa's social grants landscape, we fall into a context of poverty and hunger that seems to be worsening. Can you paint the picture of where we are as it stands in South Africa today?
Yes, by most metrics, poverty, hunger, and unemployment have worsened over recent years, especially since 2019. So we've seen an increase in the number of households experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity. And that increase has been from 27% of I'm getting my facts wrong. The increase in households experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity has been from 16% in 2019 to 20% in 2023. So 1 in 5 households experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity. And we also know that 1 in 5 households are regularly sending a member out to beg for food. So that is a dire picture of hunger that is certainly getting worse. We also know that child poverty has increased quite significantly from 55% in 2019 to about 70% now. So that's a huge jump. While at the same time, the coverage of the child support grant has decreased from about 69%, so commensurate to the number roughly in poverty, to about 65% today. Wow. And that's indicative of a broader trend across the social grant system, not only in terms of decreasing coverage and access, but also in terms of decreasing value. So social grants are less able to enable recipients to meet their basic needs now than they were previously. Of the number of households reliant on social grants, about 35% now are experiencing food insecurity, and that's worsened since 2019. So the social safety net is inadequate for our current crisis, and in many ways it's getting worse. We have a huge glaring gap in the social safety net, and that is working age adults who are in food poverty, who are unable to enter into work, not because of a lack of trying, not because of any personal failing, but because of the structural nature of unemployment, where jobs simply are not available. So by the expanded rate, which includes discouraged work seekers, 42.9% of working age adults are unemployed. And aside from the SRD grant, there is no permanent support, social assistance for that group. Social assistance is a constitutional right. and the government is required to progressively realise that right for people who need it. So what we're actually seeing with this fall in coverage relative to poverty, hunger and unemployment is a retrogression of that right. It's going backwards.
Thandi, I mean, where do we stand in terms of the way that social grants have in some ways expanded over COVID, but now there's this new contraction? And are we meeting the needs that have been so painfully exposed by Kelle?
Well, the SRD grant, I think it's important to understand, was an emergency response to the COVID pandemic. In March, we had a hard lockdown, and the rate of unemployment and poverty and debt and destitution escalated sharply. And so the social relief of distress grant was implemented and made accessible. And I use that word accessible very lightly, to beneficiaries to access. We have seen the evolution of this grant, albeit a nominal amount, the impact it has had on recipients. Just under 94% of SRD recipients use that grant for food. They use that grant to avoid hunger and starvation. And also, we've seen a lot of attack on that grant as well. I mean, the National Treasury tried very hard to terminate the grant in 2021 and almost succeeded. But through the consistent advocacy of civil society organizations, we managed to defend and to protect that grant. So just the thought of it being terminated is not only unconstitutional, but it creates panic because it'll be widespread destitution. But as far as the other grants are concerned, and I think it's safe to say, the amounts given to beneficiaries is not enough. We know this. We see the impact. I mean, the child support grant in itself is not enough to sustain a child. Grants are a constitutional right. And it is a proactive measure to fight against economic injustice. But it becomes problematic when the grants themselves aren't easily accessible, but also the amounts given don't cover basic needs. So as much as there are inroads in some regards, like the SRD grant, we are still struggling with glaring stats, as Kelle shared, of poverty and hunger, and our grants aren't just cutting it.
Leandro, can I come to you? Because in some ways, South Africa and Brazil have followed parallel experiences with social assistance and security and grants. Can you talk us through the Brazilian experience, especially since COVID, where I know there was a rapid expansion and then again, a contraction in some ways of the security that's been provided to citizens?
Well, it's an amazing opportunity to be with you guys talking about this, because I can see that, as you mentioned, there's enormous connection between the scenario in Brazil and in South Africa. And we have the famous Bolsa Família program, but it also has its ups and downs. We had this enormous success since 2003 with Bolsa Família, and it kept growing up until the very close months to the COVID, when conservative governments decided to shrink it a little bit. When COVID hit, it was the Bolsa Família platform that showed how grants to overcome the pandemic itself were so successful. And since then, Bolsa Família has not been shrinked even more. In fact, after COVID, the country decided, much because of civil society engagement and campaigns, to sustain the levels of spending throughout social policy. And this is a national issue. So civil society is discussing, academia is discussing, and politicians cannot go back to the levels of expenditure that were in place before COVID. So we had something like $7 billion being spent on Bolsa Família in 2018, 2019, and now we have something close to $40 billion. So COVID had a tremendous impact in making the expenditures as high as possible. And following my colleagues' debate on food insecurity, we have supply chains, agriculture systems that have been disrupted during the pandemic. But food insecurity is also a matter of income available to purchase food, and that is definitely something that the grants now that are back to the name of Bolsa Família, because Bolsonaro changed that in order to try to get rid of the brand that didn't belong to his government, but we went back to Bolsa Família. They are the only thing that is saying the families' income and budget in front of this disruption of supply chains and food provisions, food supply that is available. Hopefully, we can.
Yeah, you've cut out, if you can hear me, Leandro, but we'll come back to you there.
Global disruption made, for example, by the USA, the wars and stuff like that.
Kelle, can you just talk us through some of the battles you've had with government, particularly Treasury, who have tried to cut back on the SRD grant, and any other steps that you might be taking? Because I know you recently scored a court victory, but it doesn't seem as if Treasury has quite got the message yet.
Yes, a lot of our advocacy has been focused on the SRD grant, and a big part of that is because of just the sheer scale of exclusions that we're seeing from the grant. So reliable estimates suggest that about 16 to 17 million people should be eligible for that SRD grant. That's right. Adults with income below 624 Rand per month, which was at the time that this was instituted, the food poverty line. Now it's much lower than the food poverty line, which is 796. So within this group, about 16 to 17 million eligible. The budget that has been allocated for the grant covers only 7.5 million recipients each month. So there's a huge incongruence there. Within the SRD grant regulations, there's a provision that says if the budget is exhausted, the grant will stop being dispersed. So if your applicant number 7,500,001, you may not get the grant, even if you're eligible. And that is blatantly unconstitutional and arbitrary, right? But this provision, to our knowledge, hasn't been used. Instead, the government has managed to keep the disbursement of the grant below that budget cap. How have they done that when we know that 17 million people are applying for the grant? So that really correlates with the number of eligibility. Well, they've instituted procedural barriers, a number of bureaucratic hurdles to accessing the grant that have served to keep beneficiary numbers artificially low. And DSD itself has admitted that a number of barriers had to be put in place in order to stay within National Treasury's budget cap. So our litigation that you mentioned was focused on these barriers. They included the fact that the grant can only be applied for online. 18% of people in South Africa don't have internet access, and those 18% are the target population for the SRD grant, so that already excludes many. This system of bank account surveillance, bank account checks, where if you have any monetary inflows into your account above 624 Rand per month, you don't get the grant. It doesn't matter if that's a loan from a loan shark, a gift from a relative, a donation intended to enable you to survive in that month.
Right.
So this excludes many eligible people. They'll also check you against government databases like the SARS income tax database, the UAF database. We know, and again, DSD has admitted that these are woefully out of date. So people who were receiving UAF 3 years ago are found to still be ineligible for the grant, even though they haven't received UAF for a long time. So these are all of the issues that we're challenging, and also the retrogression in the value of the grant. The fact that the grant hasn't kept pace with inflation. It's 370 Rand. It's been increased from 350, but still it's able to buy much less, particularly much less food than it was when it was introduced. And we took the government to the High Court over all of these issues.
Yeah.
And the judge found in our favour on basically every single one. The judge agreed that the grant has been unconstitutionally retrogressed, that these barriers have been put in place to deliberately exclude. And so he ruled that they were invalid. The government has appealed that ruling, and we will be having another hearing in the Supreme Court of Appeal to defend it. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for the appeal to be heard, National Treasury has now imposed conditions on SASSA, the agency that disperses grants, that essentially require it to implement very similar procedures that have been used in the SRD grant to all of the other social grants, including the child support grant, the older person's grant, the disability grant. SASSA is being required to implement this bank account surveillance.
Despite this judgment that has already ruled against this for the SRDs.
Yeah, so the judgment's ruled against it in the case of the SRD, and now very similar procedures are being rolled out in the other grants. And, you know, I think it's interesting timing that whilst the appeal is pending, we're seeing this kind of hasty and almost stealthy rollout of these conditions to the other grants by way of conditionality on SASSA's operating budget. National Treasury has essentially said, if you do not do this, your operating budget can be withheld.
Thandi, I mean, what are your thoughts on the resistance we've seen and the way that government has really tried to sidestep its obligations, even in the face of court judgments? I mean, this decision to impose the same criteria on all the grants now, when a court has ruled it was wrong for SRD, I mean, it's borderline contemptuous.
Absolutely, and extremely concerning. I think it's very important to always view grants through a constitutional lens. It is a constitutional right. And failure to render the service means failure in a constitutional obligation. You know, one of these stealthy measures Kelly's speaking about is the verification process that recently was carried out and rolled out, which impacted hundreds and thousands of beneficiaries across the country. And of course, it, as Kelle said, was due to the pressure from National Treasury, but also had a lot of other implications for beneficiaries. And there were enormous issues with this rollout system. We, as Black Sash, we monitor on the ground different changes in the grant payment system and the impact it has on beneficiaries. And we closely monitored this verification process. And we saw that beneficiaries, as Kelle mentioned, the targeted beneficiaries in this case, were, they were completely, I'm trying to use the correct term and to be civil, but they were traumatized by the experience. They were not informed of this verification process, and so on grant payment day, they went to collect their grants and found out on the day that they have been selected. And of course, with their own costs, they had to travel to the closest SASSA office, and in our rural areas, that is not close to where people reside. And only then, if they are lucky to get access into that office, find out that they've been selected. And then they are sent on this tedious journey to accumulate extensive documentation to support why they should continue getting the grant. So that communication issue was the number one flaw, but another issue is the lack of capacity that SASSA had to roll out these processes. So they implement these processes, but they don't have the capacity to roll it out, which is a further barrier for beneficiaries and further disadvantage them in many different ways. SASSA can only verify 25,000 beneficiaries at a time. Almost 300,000 beneficiaries were flagged for the verification process. So it means that people who rely on this grant as a lifeline, this is the only source of income, now have to sit without anything coming into their pockets, anything to sustain them, anything to put food on the table, incurring debt, further pushing their families and catapulting them into poverty and desperation, and even safety issues, talking about loan sharks. When they go out of desperation and borrow money, there's a lot of pressure on them to repay that money, and to no fault of their own, just because the system is so flawed. So the knock-on effect for these processes is devastating for our beneficiaries. We really have seen horrible things. And just maybe to also add, at the service office rather, there's very little structural capacity to accommodate the influx of beneficiaries. So not only do beneficiaries have to come back, sometimes weeks after weeks, just to get in, to get service, but also they're exposed to so many things. We had a number of medical emergencies because our elderly people, our most vulnerable, are standing in horrible conditions day after day just to get access to submit their documentation so they can retrieve their grant. So it's very undignified.
Leandro, just listening to the South African experience, how do you reflect on the implementation questions that are relevant in Brazil?
Well, I'm surprised of how close things are, also in terms of how things are being rolled out. Although Bolsa Família is regarded as a success, we have very similar problems. We have this digitalization process of verification. We have the case for people that have to use apps on their phones in order to get the grants. And this is very complicated because the poorest families, they have no access to internet or even a phone. And I'm very surprised that we have so many connections. For example, we have people going to extensive lines in social centers here in Brazil in order to provide information that is not necessarily a mistake that they caused, but rather a automatic questioning that comes from time to time that beneficiaries have to reply with. We even have a very, I would say, ugly term that is translated probably directly as a small tooth comb. Something that goes through the hair in order to catch lens. We use this phrase here applied to social policy when they want to do some verification. And it's pretty much the same reasons. Treasury and social policy areas, they are in a permanent struggle. And I think that what decides the most is both reality and civil society engagement. I'll have the opportunity to say a few words here in a few moments, but we are also going for justice courts, justice cases, in order to provide people the grants that they are constitutionally assured. So it's pretty much the same. And I think that this whole information society puts beneficiaries in a fragile position. And that's why the debate on universal basic income, that is universal, for example, is a natural path for us discussing a progressive position towards this issue.
Yeah, let me stay with you, Leandro, on that, because you bring up universal basic income. And I suppose there would be two responses to the problems we've heard with implementation here. The one is, well, try to verify in a more seamless way and make it easier for those who fall through these verification tests. The other is to say, well, actually, the problem is trying to impose these criteria, and we should make it much simpler and much more equitable and create a universal basic income. I mean, talk us through why you think UBI, for short, is a reasonable and logical and feasible and desirable proposal.
Well, the first thing is something that Thandi mentioned, which is dignity. Dignity is the driving force behind UBI, in my opinion, because it treats everybody equally. And we know that both in South Africa, but also in Brazil, people are treated different, both by society and the state. depending on their condition, depending on the color of their skin, depending on so many conditions that they have to face, depending on geography. Here in our case, it's a very strong thing because Brazil, it's a huge country, it's a continental country. So people are treated differently depending on those conditions, and UBI treats everybody the same. And I think that the dignity behind this is above any other argument. But we also have, economic arguments. For example, once we have a universal basic income, we will observe impacts such as multiplier effects being much more stronger in society. And it doesn't mean that the richest will get the same amount, because in net terms, they will have to pay more for this to happen. So there are a lot of arguments. You can pick yours. Elon Musk has picked his reasons. We have our own, and we have just discussed this in our international congress in Brazil. But I think that everybody, every one of us that is here in this debate, are in favor, above all, for dignity of the people, right?
Absolutely. Thandi, your thoughts on this as a potential solution to the problems? Clearly, it's not working in South Africa in the way that the current implementation has played out. Is UBI the answer?
Well, I think, it's very important, Sizwe, to understand that we are facing a grave issue of inequality as far as economic standing is concerned in our society. And I think it's very glaring where I'm from in the Western Cape, but I think across the board. We are sitting with high numbers of unemployment. We're sitting with a high stats of poverty and hunger. Last year in the Eastern Cape, I think most of us know about that horrible story of a mom who had to choose a lesser of two evils. She's like, either I take my life and my kids' lives or we starve to death in 2024. So the economic injustice that we are facing as a country needs to be tackled. And I think UBI needs to be seen not as a handout, but as a transformative approach to economic justice. It really has to. The impact, I think, the research done behind it for decades cannot be refuted. It's well researched. The impact it'll have on the economy, the impact it'll have on dignity, as Leandro said, the impact it'll have on the future growth of this country holistically. It's undeniable. So it's not a matter of if it is in the way, it is the way. And the question is, how do we make this happen?
Kelle, your thoughts?
Yeah, there are many arguments to support a UBI. There are the moral arguments and the arguments from justice that I think have been made eloquently here, especially in a context like South Africa. South Africa is, as we all know at this point, the most unequal country in the world, and that inequality is a result, in large part of South Africa's legacy of apartheid dispossession. And so you can make a strong argument for a redistributive policy like UBI from that history. It's basic justice, and it's about giving people dignity. But there are also many practical arguments based on extensive evidence and research pilots, trials from all over the world that show that UBI is a smart policy. We've discussed how essentially all attempts to target social assistance at those who are deemed to be deserving by some criteria set by the government will fail on their own merits. People will always fall through the cracks. As soon as you put even one bureaucratic hurdle in the way, the most vulnerable will struggle to overcome that hurdle. So there's a practical argument for universality as bringing everyone along, it leaves no one behind. But then there are also the macroeconomic arguments for UBI. We have seen this at least a decade of austerity policy where National Treasury has told us over and over that the way out of our crisis is to cut social spending, and somehow magically investment is going to flow in
we're
to
still waiting for that.
fix the problem. That's clearly not working. We need a new macroeconomic paradigm, and a UBI is a huge part of the solution to that, because what it does is it stimulates the economy. It puts money in the pockets of people who have been economically excluded. They take that money and spend it in their local communities. They start businesses. They contribute to local businesses. They search for jobs. Research has found that the cost of searching for a job in South Africa is 1,417 Rand in 2024. So compare that to the 370 SRD grant. This is just about it's about removing the barriers that are standing in the way of people being able to contribute, participate in the economy. And UBI is a very, very practical, immediate, direct, effective way to do that. Yeah. It also is about redistributive justice and dignity. And it does all of those things.
I guess there are some counter arguments that we need to consider, and we can probably group them into 3 categories. The first, which I want to put to all of you, is this idea that somehow giving people income will promote a lack of productivity in the economy. The worst kind of version of this is an idea that this somehow promotes laziness. How do you respond to that, Thandi?
Well, I think, just on the latter assumption, and I think often that assumption is made and that narrative comes from a place of privilege and also a place of ignorance. We conducted as Black Sash a nationwide documentary on UBI. And we posed the same question to every single one of the interviewees. And that is, if you had a choice between a job, a permanent job, or a grant, which one would you choose? Obviously, every single one of them said permanent income, permanent employment, for their own family's well-being, for the consistency, and also so they can be active members of the economy. I think that's everybody's baseline desire. So that narrative can be dangerous, but again, it has to be viewed from where it comes from. The reality on the ground is very different. And we know the stats. We can all spit out the stats about unemployment. There's just a lack of jobs. And so, in order, again, as Kelle gave that stat, and that 1,417 is per month. In order for people to even get onto the job search venture, they need income to do that. And not having any income excludes people from even accessing those job opportunities. So that lazy narrative is actually lazy in itself. You need to do your research and understand why this is so important. Yeah.
Leandro, your thoughts in response to that trope that is often raised when the specter of universal basic income is introduced?
Well, there's a good question, because every UBI experiment, every UBI pilot or policy that has been tried to this point and that has been followed by experts, researchers, social scientists, they show that people actually work a little more to get a UBI. That's the case, for example, for Finland, where the results were unexpected. It was probably the first example of a major experiment that was closely followed by researchers that made the news, and they were actually working more after getting the UBI. So the Maricá case, which is a city here in the coast of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, is also the same. And the people that work a little less than otherwise than if they didn't get the basic income, it is because they are refusing, non-decent jobs, let's say, or participation in labor market in a form that would harm their condition to take care of their families, to use their time properly, and so on and so forth. So, and there's a second question that is, UBI can enable people to, have the tranquility to engage the economics of caring of their own family. That is not measured by traditional standards, by traditional rates for economic growth, for example. Provide care for the others. And if people are providing more care for their loved ones, for their community, I think that's good that they are not in the formal labor market. So we have an impact on wages that grow up. We have an impact on care. And that's, I think that this will be considered more and more important in the following years. People are going to try to measure care in the society, and they will perceive value, and universal basic income will allow to grow more and more. And I think that in underdeveloped countries, or in countries in development like ours, that is crucial, because we have a population that is getting older, but conditions for this is not ideal. People don't have their pensions assured. We don't have a health system that can save their lives or take care of them. So I think UBI will play a major role in this situation.
Kelle, any further thoughts on this idea that it disincentivizes economic productivity?
All the evidence that we have from numerous trials, experiments, pilots shows that it does exactly the opposite. I think the point about care is very important, and it, there's of course a gender dimension to this.
Absolutely.
Women do the vast majority of care in our society, and we see the ways that unpaid care is disadvantaged in our economy. Women-headed households are much more likely to experience food poverty. So there is this very important argument for UBI that it goes some way to offsetting the unpaid care work that is so critical to our economy. And I think that Leandro's point about UBI as a powerful developmental policy in the global south is also something really to emphasize, because when, for instance, Elon Musk talks about the need for a UBI in the United States, or we hear about UBI in the global north, there are slightly different arguments that are put forward for, AI taking jobs, and so the need for a UBI in those contexts. Whereas we're in a context where the crisis is now, the unemployment crisis is right now, and UBI is really the most effective and kind of direct intervention that a global south government can make, government like South Africa in that situation. So it's about driving development, and that's supported by the research that talks about the multiplier effect of social protection spending. We know that the multiplier effect is more pronounced in countries that have higher inequality. So this is the idea that every rand spent on social protection in South Africa creates more than 1 rand in the economy that flows back into government revenue, and it enables further expansion of the social wage over time. And another trial that was conducted that I think is relevant to the South African context is Namibia, where a universal basic income trial resulted in people increasing their income from self-employment over and above the amount of the UBI by more than 300%. So this is startling, and it really points to this developmental impact of UBI. The problem is the evidence is there. The policymakers know, or they should know by now, because we've been hammering down their door with it for years. So why are we not moving in this direction? And I think that's a question of political will.
One of the other objections, Thandi, is the idea of the economy overheating, that there will be this big spike in inflation and prices will rise as incomes rise. What do you make of that suggestion?
I mean, Kelly's best placed to speak from a numbers perspective and the research around that. So I may defer to Kelly, but I think, again, just speaking to the evidence, I mean, there are economists who have taken their time and have applied through pilots, through their own extensive research, that the exact opposite will happen. And I think it's very easy to come up with a lot of excuses not to have UBI. And it's quite easy to refute those excuses and to debunk those myths. But the evidence is glaring, and it is there, and it's been there for decades. And so the economic benefit of a UBI is undeniable. And as Kelly says, the policymakers know this, government knows this, they have access to this, but it's the political will that we are working very hard as civil society organization and particularly through the Universal Basic Income Coalition, to get the buy-in of government, to support and to make this become a reality rather, so that we can not see moms having to decide between taking their lives, and their kids' lives, and not starving to death, that we can see people, especially our young people, actively participate in the economy, and to be able to see small businesses also grow with that support that UBI provides.
Absolutely. Leandro, your thoughts on this counter-argument that gets raised about inflation? And Kelly will also come to you on this.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question because people that raise this question, especially about inflation, are usually mainstream economists, for example, people that are going to the news to advocate for shrinking the social grants as they are now, because of Treasury issues, fiscal issues, and stuff like that. But I think that in this case, the Bolsa Família program in Brazil has a massive impact because I don't know if you are aware, but a fourth of the population in Brazil lives out of Bolsa Família. So it's a lot of people. It's 58 million people. But it didn't start with that number. We started with 3 million families, and it grew up constantly until 2018. And the fact that it grew constantly, but step by step towards these levels, had the opposite impact rather than inflation, because product increased faster than inflation, because these people have the necessity to buy, but as this was implemented stage by stage, it had enough time for the product to grow and sustain the supply side of the thing. So we now have to counterbalance inflation with the multiplier effect, and the multiplier effect can be balanced depending on the speed that you provide people with money. So if you do it slowly, you give enough time for the supply side to follow it, and then you will have a situation like ours in Brazil, in which even accounting for inflation, every R$1 invested in Bolsa Família, the economy grows R$1.78, which means a huge multiplier effect. So social grants, if they are implemented carefully without major steps or breaking points, they can actually boost the economy of the country instead of causing inflation. Of course, the opposite also happens. The case for iron is very relevant, in which they replaced gas subsidies in a single day. They were turned into benefits, and that caused inflation. But that's not the case if you go step by step. First, for example, providing for the people most in need, like the case of Bolsa Família, and like the case that I believe that is more suitable for South Africa. And then you will observe the growth faster than inflation rates growing.
Kelly, your thoughts?
Yes, this phased-in approach is exactly what activists are calling for in South Africa. The
Really
progressive
important
realisation of a UBI in line with the constitutional obligation on the
rather than
government.
a regressive falling off. of grants.
Exactly. So we're not calling for a massive injection of money into the economy overnight. We're not calling for a UBI to be realised tomorrow. We're calling for targets and timeframes to be set for the realization of an adequate UBI over, say, a period of 10 years. And I think that is one important measure to counter potential shocks to the economy or inflationary impacts. But there are a couple of other reasons why we don't think this kind of UBI would be inflationary in South Africa. One is that inflation, of course, in the very basic analysis, depends on the balance of supply and demand. When we're talking about basic goods, and particularly food items, we know that there's enough supply in South Africa, similar to the Brazilian case that Leandro mentioned. We know there's enough supply of food. The reason that people can't eat is because they don't have income to buy that food. So what you would be doing with expanded social protection UBI is unlocking some of that latent demand. But that doesn't necessarily mean that demand is going to outstrip supply, leading to inflation. And because of the phased-in approach, supply has time also to keep up. And the other point here that I think is quite important is that the model of a UBI that's being advanced in South Africa is a redistributive model. That means that we're not advocating for a huge amount of extra borrowing to fund a UBI. What we're advocating for is that UBI is predominantly funded by additional progressive taxation measures. That means additional taxes on the wealthiest in our society. We think that this is entirely appropriate given our context of inequality. So what you're doing is not injecting a bunch of cash into the economy, but redistributing existing wealth in the economy to the lower deciles.
Absolutely, really fascinating. And it feels as if a lot of the objections just aren't very familiar with the evidence. It's like a knee-jerk trope rather than a well-researched position. One of the things that really strikes me and stands out for me is the elegance of universal basic income. Just the simplicity, and I mean, we are having problems in South Africa, specifically with our capacity to administer complex policies. This would make the administration much easier, surely, as well. Thandi?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Speaking about the universal nature of UBI, the fact that unlike other exclusionary procedures like targeting or a means test, it's available to everybody who resides in South Africa. So the accessibility, or rather the requirement measures placed on existing grants, won't exist with UBI because the universal nature of it, rather. And as Kelle said, the distribution of the grants, obviously it will be easier to accrue to the poorest through the progressive tax measures, but making it available to all.
Yeah.
I think also, I just want to add on to what Kelle said, and an assumption that a lot of people make is that, wealth is everlasting. Even the wealthiest fall on hard times. And to have that net, just to make sure that you can get through that month is life-saving and life-changing for many. So you're right, it's a very simple model, and it's not complex in its nature. I think, again, it just is long overdue. And our people need it.
Kelle, you wanted to comment on the elegance of UBI as a proposal.
Yes, I think that it's important not to kind of fall into thinking of it as a silver bullet. It's not a silver bullet, and it's not going to solve all of the problems in South Africa. And it's, possibly a little bit naive to see it in that light. A UBI would not get us out of the present crisis by any means if it came at the expense of spending on basic services, things like healthcare and education.
Sure.
we need to be resourcing these services, and we need to be ensuring that the infrastructure is in place to enable economic activity at the same time as we're providing income support. So yes, it is a simple and elegant way to improve the problems in our current social grant system, way to plug the gaps in the social grant system, but it's not advanced as a replacement for, the existing social wage or basic services. Whereas sometimes you hear UBI proposals coming from the right, from a libertarian viewpoint, and that is often what those proposals are saying. So we're making a very different argument here. But it's true that the administration of the social grant system and the efforts to limit fraud in the grant system or limit grants going to people who might earn just a tiny bit above the means test are extremely expensive. These bank surveillance checks cost 1 cent every time. So that's 17 million beneficiaries being checked every month. Obviously, a UBI would involve a reasonably higher cost to the fiscus than the current social grant system, but we would be reducing administrative costs significantly, and in the process reducing possibilities for corruption in the system. So it is much fairer.
No, important clarification. And yes, Thandi, Leandro, Kelle, we've explored various counter arguments. We've also looked at the status quo in terms of Brazil and South Africa at the moment, where we are, what government is doing. What are your final thoughts, and what do you think should be the next step from here in terms of those who are keen to realize universal basic income?
Well, I think it's important that we have a unified stance on UBI and to understand that we have transitioned from fighting the unjust laws of apartheid to now fighting economic injustice. And it's a fight that everybody needs to take up arms and fight against. And so dispelling narratives is part of it, but also applying healthy pressure on policy development and the government to make this become a reality. UBI needs to be seen through a lens of rights, through the lens of social solidarity, and also through the lens of dignity. We will keep on fighting the good fight for UBI collectively, a civil society organization, and not just UBI on its own, but being part of a basic basket of needs that everybody residing in South Africa needs to live a dignified life. And Black Sash is embarking on a social protection floor and understanding what that means in a South African context, and what needs you need, I have to have in order to live a dignified life as an active citizen, participating both in the economy and the growth of this country.
Leandro?
Well, I didn't sit passing for this conversation, so it means it is fantastic that we are having this conversation, and I feel so close connected to the case for UBI and for social policy in general in South Africa. So I think it's just a departing point for collaboration. The Brazilian Basic Income Network has a perspective that is so close to what my colleagues have debated here, and I hope we can deepen collaboration, thoughts, and a struggle for a more justice society in which freedom and dignity are boosted by overcoming challenges that are the challenges of our time. I think we have the opportunity here to suggest something new and that is aligned to what someone's needs in this century. I feel like we are in the verge of this, and I appreciated the opportunity to be in this podcast, this conversation with you guys. I really think that South Africa is in the center of this whole thing. There's the G20 happen. There's the BRICS that we didn't have time to talk about, but I'm sure that we will meet again. hopefully I'm doing a second round in person there with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Leandro. Kelle, your final thoughts.
What we're seeing in the grant system now is enormous, erroneous exclusion. That's exclusion of people who, by the existing criteria, should qualify. And that's under the banner of a clampdown on welfare fraud. I think that there's a huge conflation in terms here. We have seen fraud in the welfare system, but that fraud has been perpetrated by sophisticated syndicates, government officials, not individual mothers or older persons who might have earned slightly above the means test threshold last month. But these are the people who are being branded fraudsters, and using this narrative, the government is clamping down on grants. The good news is that we have a very strong civil society coalition, the Universal Basic Income Coalition,
Absolutely.
which has had a number of successes, and that includes a lot of different voices, from organised labour, Kasatu, SAFTU are members of the coalition, to human rights organisations like the Black Sash and research institutes like the IEJ. So UBIC will continue advocating for the progressive realisation of UBI from the base of the Social Relief of Distress grant, and we will continue fighting repeated assaults on social grants like the one we're seeing currently from National Treasury. So
Absolutely.
while we're waiting for our existing court case to be heard, we're trying every avenue to show the policymakers the ways that these decisions are impacting on rights, the ways that they are retrogressing social protection, and further litigation is a last resort. But we so far are not having a lot of luck in getting these policies changed and improving things for beneficiaries. And so that is an option that we will consider if we need to.
Well, Kelle, Thandi, Leandro, thank you so much for a fascinating, stimulating conversation on the need to think different and shift policy in a more just and equal direction. It's been wonderful to have you all with us. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Economic Justice Matters. This series is all about challenging current policy, creating a more just economy where we consider taking big, yes, radical steps towards shifting our society. And I hope this conversation has helped and encouraged you to rethink some of your economic assumptions and take the brave, bold, new directions that we need to as a country to shift away from this current injustice we currently face. Like, share, subscribe, take us to 300,000 subscribers. Oops, actually, we've already reached that milestone. Thank you so much. Keep liking, sharing, subscribing, and catch us on the next episode of SMWX, and look out for future installments of Economic Justice Matters. A reminder, check out the Institute for Economic Justice, check out the Black Sash too. The Institute for Economic Justice has a really interesting and fascinating newsletter as well. So if you want to further your knowledge about this and other questions, make sure you subscribe to that newsletter, and let's continue to build an ecosystem for economic justice. Aye.